Hello and welcome to the Rust Belt Apartment Podcast, where we discussed all things apartments with a keen focus on the Midwest's Rust Belt region. I'm your moderator, Peter Graylis, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host and Cooper Multifamily team member, Gary Cooper. Today's guests are part of the Colliers family, Kourosh, Bakhtvar, and Mehdi Star, co-founders of the Net Lease Exchange platform, or NLX for short. The NLX platform focuses on advising investors who are considering a 1031 exchange into passive investments. Often representing clients who are transitioning between real estate asset classes, NLX provides education, execution, and lifetime customer service for clients who seek to purchase net lease or DST investments. Mehdi and Kourosh have completed over 100 transactions across the country over the past 10 years and strive to provide their clients the data needed to make an informed decision about their real estate investments. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for having us. This is
great. It's my pleasure.
What city do we have in the background?
This is San Francisco behind us.
Do you see the doom loop?
I do. Look at that. Well, Mehdi, we're seeing the nice skyline view,
right?
Level view.
They don't show that on the news.
Because I'm looking at this and I'm like, it's San Francisco. It's all fake news. I mean, look, it's beautiful. Oh, man. Well, thanks for joining us, guys. And sort of as usual, I'm going to give a little bit of a history background on 1031 exchanges, sort of to start us off. Again, there's a lot of misinformation or fake news about what 1031 exchanges are. And a lot of folks think this is some kind of recent addition to the tax code, or Donald Trump must have thought this up or something else because he was a real estate guy. And, the truth of the matter is like-kind exchanges, or just exchanges in themselves, have been in the tax code ever since almost the tax code came about. So the first Internal Revenue Tax Code was 1918. And in 1921, basically what was the predecessor of Section 1031 was enacted into the tax code. So within the first 3 years, this was enacted, the ability to exchange one property for another was enacted. Initially, when that was done, you could trade anything for anything. So if you had IBM securities, if IBM existed back then, I think maybe they you could trade that for a piece of real estate, or you could trade a horse for farmland, or you could trade anything for anything. And then around 1924, they sort of said, no, hey, you got to trade like kind for like kind. So if you got a securities, you got to trade it for securities. If you got a farm, you got to trade it, or a horse, you got to trade it for horse, or cattle for cattle, or a widget maker for another widget maker. And then in 1928, it basically became just real estate, or mostly real estate that was part of this exchange environment. And that stayed true basically in 1984. It didn't really change. And believe it or not, and this will show my age and predate a lot of you guys, in 1984, or actually 1031 in 1954 was renamed 1031 as we know it now. From the previous provision it was. And in 1979, there was a very famous case called the Starker case. So most of the exchanges we talk about really are known as Starker exchanges, because and Starker was a non-simultaneous exchange kind of event. But it really didn't get popular sort of till 1984. So I had a few years where, and the reason 1984 came about is because that's when they basically identified the 45-day, the 180-day time frame. So even though the tax court decided in 79, nothing really happened till 1984. So imagine that, 5 years for the court system and the government to figure out regulations on how to do this. But so very early in my career, you did exchanges, and there was exchanger groups. And what would happen is literally they were exactly what it sounds like, a simultaneous exchange. I had an apartment building, you had a CVS drugstore, and we would exchange. Wow. And that's how it worked. And then you think about it as like, well, I understand maybe why the apartment guy wants the CVS, but why would the CVS guy want the apartment building? Mm-hmm. So then I'd have to figure out, well, okay, then I'll find this guy with an industrial building that wants the apartment building, and then you'd basically the CVS guy's like, okay, I'll take the industrial building. Then he sort of changes his mind. He's like, I really want a medical office building. So then you find a medical office building guy, get him to get the industrial building, and then trade to the apartment and then into the CVS. So, and there was exchanger groups around the country where you'd go there, there'd be 20 brokers like myself in there. And it's like, hey, what do you, wants and needs? What do you have? And so literally, we'd create these things. So the first exchange I was involved in was an 11-way exchange. There was 11 properties because you had to basically you had to take whatever the other guy had, or you had to find somebody to take that. So you always had to have an exit person to be able to do that. And believe it or not, Peter, it's one of the apartment buildings that Jeff Zuckerman and his group own in Eastlake. That was part of
wow.
With Maple Park Apartments. But in 1984, they sort of came up, the Starker Exchange really sort of took off because a lot of the rules and regulations were codified and made our lives a lot easier in 1031 exchanges. And certainly in the 1986 Tax Reform Act got rid of capital gains at the time, which then really kickstarted people doing non-simultaneous exchanges and creating the market that we really know now. So that's probably more than anybody wanted to know about exchange.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Like I said, there's almost there's 100 years of history with 1031 exchanges in that process. So with that, I'll turn it over back to our moderator, and we can start talking about what it's like today and what that market looks like.
Yeah, Kourosh, Mehdi, what do you guys think about an 11 property exchange? Sounds pretty
Unbelievable.
fun.
We had a situation where a client was selling an apartment. They were selling two properties. One of them was a triple net. One of them was a medical office building. They needed both of them sold to buy the Walgreens that they wanted to purchase. They ended up selling the Family Dollar to a client who sold an apartment. And so that worked out. But the medical office building went in and out of contract 2-3 times. I mean, it got to a point where we had the Walgreens in contract. We needed time. So we had to pay the seller something like 20 or 30 grand for an extension. I just can't imagine an 11 property exchange.
And literally they'd all have to close on that and the same escrow, the same day, same time. So all the money, all the different parties, all the signatures, all the documents. And believe it or not, I mean, this stuff still happened. I only did a few of those because you can imagine. And some of them, the other ones were 3, 4, 5 party exchanges. Sure. Still getting 2 parties to agree, as you guys know.
Absolutely. And something comes up with one of the properties. There's an issue. They can't move forward. Now everyone else
had that where something happens, and then all of a sudden you got to find, all of a sudden, one cog of those 11 properties.
Right.
You're done.
That's
so
too much
to be able to do it. But with ours, the biggest way it comes up, especially in multifamily real estate, usually it's when people are exiting the business to a certain degree. There's really two things. One is, hey, it's time to retire. I'm sick of toilets. I'm sick of the phone calls. I'm sick of this stuff, but I'm not going to pay Uncle Sam the money. What can I do? 1031 exchanges comes up as an idea. They start talking about it. They start hearing about net lease opportunities, and they don't get the phone calls in the middle of the night. And, maybe, especially if it's backed by a credit tenant, the money's in your account on the 3rd of the month, the 2nd of the month, or the 1st of the month, or whatever. So that's very attractive to our apartment buyers or apartment sellers that are, looking to exit the business, but yet have to remain in the business and want consistent cash flow, without some of the management headaches. The second thing is, again, when folks are looking at it, when they want to diversify their portfolio and or sort of, again, manage their profile, their management profile, and what they can do. So, with a lot of, especially if you're doing turnaround situations or value add multifamily, you've got to have all your concentration there. So they'll sell 2, 3, or 4 other stabilized deals and trade them into a single tenant or a net lease deal in order to then make their life a little bit easier to focus on the value add deal. But I'm assuming a lot of your 1031 buyers are multifamily folks that are retiring or looking for easier management.
That's right. And we'll let Mehdi talk about kind of how our group started, but his genesis was on the San Francisco multifamily team. Now, as
Okay.
we are growing our group, we're getting to see other sorts of sellers, not just multifamily or single family rentals, but also multi-tenant commercial, whether that's office, industrial, retail. But it might help, Mehdi, if you discuss kind of how MLX came to be and your start with the San Francisco team here.
Sure, absolutely. And it leads, I think, very well to what you're saying, Gary, about the reasons why folks engage the 1031 process in the first place. A lot of longtime owners who have owned these assets, especially here in California in the Bay Area, where there's so much value creation because rents have skyrocketed compared to 20 years ago. And so you have folks with a low basis that are selling, and their tax liability is in the millions.
Yeah.
So why take that off the table, give it to the government, and have to rework another 15, 20 years to get that kind of equity back in the deal? And so that's why the 1031 exchange makes a lot of sense. If it's an appropriate time, I'd like to talk about our genesis. It really did begin.
Please do.
My family.
Please do.
So James DiVincenzi, Brad Lagomarsino here in the San Francisco market.
I know Jim well because we were at Barnes and Millichap at the same
That's
time.
right.
And actually, I was involved. Jim bought a Barnes and Noble.
He did in Mentor,
Ohio.
Yep.
And
still
I was
has
involved
that
in that transaction way back when. So
Where are
He
you?
still has it.
he still has it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a good piece of real estate.
Yeah.
Questionable
great market.
tenant, but good real estate. So I joined, I was in law school at USF here in the city, University of San Francisco.
Mhm.
I was studying for civil procedure final and just tearing my hair out. I did not want to be a lawyer. I knew I didn't want to be a practicing attorney. So while I was in law school, I joined a gal who had a property management company, very small shop, and I started managing apartment buildings in San Francisco while I was going to law school. Fast forward a couple years, I graduate law school. I try my own hand at starting a property management firm. It does not take off. Our business is very much relationship oriented. You have to have relationships. You could have all the knowledge and skill in the world. It's about relationships at the end of the day. And so I realized that very quickly and joined James DiVincenzi and Brad Lagomarsino at Colliers. I was James's assistant at the time. And this is a really fun story. I'm first generation, so is Kourosh. Our parents immigrated from Iran. And I'm the only son in the family. I have a younger sister, 18 months apart, not that much younger. We both went to law school. She finished, she got her law degree and ended up interning at a very, powerful real estate firm in Walnut Creek called Miller Star Regalia. And I remember going to my dad and saying, "Hey, Dad, my sister's joined a law firm. That's great. I'm actually going to be an assistant to a real estate agent in San Francisco." He was so upset. But I had this vision. I knew what I wanted to do. And learning from James, I was in the office hearing every conversation, was just the most valuable experience. He was paying me next to nothing, but I would have paid him if he knew, just to get that knowledge. So, it happened that you're cold calling, you transition from assistant to independent contractor, you're on the phones, you're hunting for rent roll and expenses, personal issues came up. I was unable to make those 50 calls a day, but I saw at the end of the year, my commission dollars were coming in, and they were referrals from apartment brokers like James, like Brad, and other team members. They had sold the apartment. Client wanted to do a trade. Because of my legal background, they felt comfortable having the client engage me in understanding the terms, the obligations, rights and duties in the lease agreement for these triple nets. And so it was in going through that process and navigating the net lease market that it was like, wow, for a buyer to do this on their own is near impossible. There really needs to be representation for folks who are in a 1031 exchange and looking to put funds into this kind of passive investment. And that's when Net Lease Exchange was born and Kourosh joined Colliers. And together we formed this team focusing on the 1031 exchange into passive investments, net lease, and most recently now DSTs.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
no, great overview and a great, springboard again, James and his team there. They're
Good.
legends, not only in San Francisco, but sort of nationwide and what they were able, to do and the level of client service
Right.
and the professionalism in what they do. They bring to the table. It's just amazing. So, again, perfect play. I'm a closet lawyer as well.
Yeah.
I got licensed as an agent when I actually took the test in 18. It took longer to find out that you passed the real estate exam back when I did it than it took to find out about the bar.
Oh, wow.
Believe it or not, because it wasn't as easy as it was today. It was only offered a few times a year, and they manually score the test, and you wouldn't know for about 4 months if you passed or not.
That's wild.
Kind of thing. But again, when I got involved in real estate, literally every client I was dealing with, owner, was a lawyer. And so it just sort of made sense. Hey, if you're going to get an educational background, the MBA in finance and doing group projects didn't sound as attractive as, hey, studying the law and learning some of those skill sets to apply to what, moving forward. And I've sort of built a career with that because very much like you, people come to me and it's like, hey, when we're talking 1031, they don't, half of they go to their accountant and their accountant doesn't understand. Then I've got to explain to their accountant or even a lot of times their lawyer how this actually physically works, what the real rules are, what the regulations are, ask them if they've ever actually read Section 1031. Amazing, some of these folks that talk about it and they've never, it's only a page and a half,
right.
But they haven't read the actual code, which is sort of amazing. But, there's a whole bunch of stuff, and I don't want to get into that because there's enough podcasts and enough stuff online to talk about the 45 days, the 180 days, the replacement. I want to talk a little bit more about the practical aspects because that's what our clients are sort of concerned about. If I sell my apartment building, are you going to be able to find me that CVS to trade into, or Walgreens or Family Dollar or whatever.
Yeah.
And so maybe talk a little bit about the liquidity, what that process looks like. And, many people are under the assumption it's like, you almost put the cart before the horse. It's like, I almost got to do a reverse exchange and close on the 1031 because, those go on the market and within a week they're gone. And I don't know what I'm going to do, but I also don't want to get stuck buying a gas station in Sheboygan, because
I'm under the gun.
Because I'm under the deadlines, right?
Right. Go for it.
Yeah, I could chime into that. So general question is, right, how does a client get comfortable with the process or what happens after they sell, right? Knowing their exit strategy in mind before they even go to list the property, their apartment building. And we pride ourselves on that process, which is distilled down to 3 phases, right? It's qualification, education, and execution. So the first touch, and this goes back to the profile of our typical client, most of them are first-time investors of this new asset class. So they're trading product types. They're switching out of multifamily, going into single tenant net lease. So the first question is, does this product type even make sense for you, right? And that starts with that first interaction or first conversation with that owner. What are your investment goals? And why are you even selling in the first place, right? And if those reasons are tired of management, I want something passive, whether it's for myself, for my heirs, a lot of owners want to take advantage of a step up in basis and plan for that in the future for their heirs to inherit. And if those reasons check off, those boxes check, then we tell them, okay, net lease makes sense for you, right? And with that qualification phase completed, then we move on to education, right? And that's, here's what a net lease investment is, here are the pros and cons, here's how to evaluate these deals. And with that, it's the client getting comfortable with the fact that you have a strong tenant in tow, you're buying 2 things, right? Real estate and the lease. And then also putting in that equation, how long they plan to own that investment. Those are all factors that can help, right, them decide, okay, does this investment type class make sense for me or not? And so through that education process, we start to just show them a lot of deals to the point where they can start analyzing deals even without our help, right? Because of that education. And the goal is, as they see these net lease opportunities, let's call it upwards of 50 to 100 deals during that time frame, they're still working with you guys on evaluating the property that they want to sell and potentially prepping it to get that listed on the market. So that when they are actually on the market and decide to pull the trigger and go live on market for their multifamily project, by then they've already seen plenty of deals where they're at a point they can say, yeah, if I was ready today to make an offer on a net lease deal, here would be my option A, B, C, right? Knowing full well that, as you mentioned, Gary, it's a national marketplace. So someone in Ohio can buy a deal in Florida, someone in Florida can buy a deal in Texas, and et cetera. So if these deals are accurately priced, they generally tend to get scooped up within, call it 2 to 4 weeks when they're first introduced to the market. And so if we show them a deal before they're even selling their multifamily project, you're right, it's likely not going to be available by the time they're ready to do their trade. But we'll keep working with them and showing example deals of what's out there. So we build that profile for them. So when we're ready to execute, right, that final phase, we can go out to our contacts, sellers, as well as agents to source off-market product that we know is protected, and we'll be there when they're ready to do their exchange.
Yeah, no, that's and that's the other, the confusion a lot of times is not only about the process, like how do I do this, but the question I get the most, and it's not even a tax question, it's like what they want to do is replace the cash flow from the apartment building. So let's just, I'm going to pick a number. They make $15,000 a month from this investment that they've almost paid off or whatever. It's providing a nice retirement sum. It's paying their bills and whatnot. So they're like, hey, at the end of the day, I want to make, what do I do? But I want to get, basically I want a distribution of $15,000. It's almost like they're looking at you guys as an annuity. It's like, how much do I invest? How do I do that? How does that sort of play in to the equation, when folks are evaluating this? What are maybe some of the big different single tenant deals? We all talk about Family Dollars, and I've thrown out CVS a few times, and there's FedEx distribution facilities, and there's a whole range of sort of options. What do they look like? What do those cash flow streams and cap rates look like right now? If you break it down to maybe a couple big categories.
Sure. To your first point, in terms of replacing income, a lot of folks are doing the 1031 exchange because they want either to replace or improve on income. That was difficult to do with net lease, I would say, a year and a half ago, when it was just so competitive. It was a bidding war almost on any deal that we wrote on. You'd have 5 or 6 offers at the table. And I mean, gosh, it got to a point where we had to put up non-refundable money day one to be awarded the deal. It was insane.
Isn't that great?
It's great for the seller.
As a broker. Not for the buyer. For the seller and the broker, it's great.
Yeah, it's great for the seller. It was tough for us who we were representing buyers exclusively. That's all we work with. And so difficult for clients to replace income in that environment. Now, obviously, interest rates have moved since then. Cap rates, unfortunately, it's not lockstep with the interest rate movement we've realized. And so it's tough. I will say that net lease today in the market, if you're all cash, great. Basis points, about what, 50, 75 basis point movement. We're doing a Jiffy Lube right now in Tallahassee, Florida. Same developer had built 2 other sites in Florida that they had sold a year ago for a 4.5% cap rate. They were adamant. They really wanted that sub 5% return on this last site. We're in contract at a 5.35% cap rate. We're getting close to 100 basis point spread between where they did their first 2 deals and this one, simply because of interest rate movement. Now, that being said, the client had to go place debt on that property. They'd be negative leverage, financing 6.25. They're at 5.35. So net lease, it has its place, especially if you're all cash. I mentioned Jiffy Lube at 5.35.
Got a Wendy's as well, 5.75. So on average, today's market is around 5.5 cap. That's the return on average net lease deal is offering. And it
And
starts.
so the category. So obviously the fast food, right? Because most McDonald's, or in fact, almost all McDonald's are basically owned by an investor, correct? The actual real estate itself.
McDonald's typically they're sold as ground leases, where if a buyer wants to buy that investment, they would own the ground, the dirt, and it's typically the tenant or McDonald's who owns the building, the improvements itself. In terms of the categories for net lease, it's a function of what your price range is. And so in the, call it sub 5 million, 1 to 5 million range, it's going to be fast food, it's going to be auto repair, some drugstores, those are typically at a higher price point. Coffee is another one.
Coffee.
So your typical footprint of these deals around 5,000 square feet or less. When you get to deals between 5 to 10 million, that's where you see more drugstores, some 7-Eleven with gas stations. And there you've got square footage of around 10,000, right? And then if you go north of 10 million, that's where it unlocks the larger opportunities. Think FedEx, right? Distribution facilities, much larger footprints and larger use cases.
How different is the sort of the deal, the land lease deals versus the fee simple deals?
Sure. So with a ground lease investment, you only own the dirt. And so the biggest drawback to that is there's no depreciation because you can't depreciate dirt itself. And so it's looking at that investor's position in their multifamily project. If they've owned it for over 27 and a half years, maybe they've exhausted the depreciation, it could be a situation where it makes sense for them, right? And we say that because the ground lease is the safest form of ownership in that lease. You only own the dirt. There's no management involved, no risk really. And typically what you'll see in these ground leases is there's a reversionary interest, meaning that let's say, for example, McDonald's signs a 15-year lease, ground lease, and that reversionary clause exists. At the end of the 15 years, if McDonald's decides, hey, I'm going to vacate and go to a new space, they're not going to take the building up and with them. And therefore the owner, would inherit those improvements. And so in that way, the tenant has skin in the game, right? They've invested in that building itself, the improvements, so they're more likely to stay beyond the base term of the lease.
Gotcha. I know a lot of there was a lot of bank branches for a while that were available. And I'm assuming I think most of those were ground leases.
Many of them are.
I'm going to ask one more question because then I see Peter,
No, go ahead, Gary. Go ahead.
Let him talk yet. But again,
not a problem.
This is such a huge part of our business, and it's the number one question we're sort of asked on especially here, in San Francisco, or if you knew Alex Maharabi, right? So Alex would sell the same damn apartment building 3 times than, Lit Empire, whatever. My average length of ownership is 32 years of people. So, you get one chance to sell and then, you're not going to see them again for 32 years, kind of thing. So, it makes a difference how that's going to all sort of play together,
Totally. And most of our owners fit that profile. They're long-term owners of real estate. And it takes time for them to get comfortable, especially with a new concept. I've owned apartments for 3 decades, and you now want me to consider a net lease? What? Out of state? What are you talking about? And so we often see that it takes a minimum a year from after our first introduction until when the client finally decides, okay, yes, I'm ready to start, taking this path forward and making the movement.
Yeah. So when you got that, again, some of the categories we talked about, right? So bank ground leases, drugstores, the Jiffy Lube, and some of the oil sort of fast change oils and so forth. You look at them, a lot of our apartment clients are pretty conservative people. That's why they're in apartments. They look at that and they're like, man, drugstores aren't even going to exist in 10 years. I don't care that I got a 20-year lease. Or Jiffy Lube, you guys are in California, there won't be any oil changes by 2030 in California, kind of thing. And they're thinking about, you look at some of these, let's say, hey, is that business model going to change, so much that this single tenant lease isn't going to be there? And walk people off the ledge talking about, again, bank branches that are, because again, everything's virtual there, or again, oil changes, or even the dollar store concept. So maybe if you guys want to chat a little bit about that, and then we'll get into a few other like more detailed questions.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it all comes down to the comfort level of the investor, ultimately, what they're looking to achieve, because what we saw during COVID really separated some of the stronger tenants and uses from some of the weaker tenants and uses. Give you just a stark example of your standard Chili's or Red Robin, or name your
Sit down.
fast casual sit down restaurant versus your Burger King, Wendy's, Taco Bell's that have the drive-through component. During shelter in place, those dining halls were shut down. Those fast food tenants that had the drive-through window were still operating and selling burgers and tacos and able to afford the rent. Or those tenants that have a plan. Like Circuit City doesn't exist anymore, but Best Buy knew that, hey, we need to adopt and plan accordingly for the future that we're entering into, which is, the common is the Amazon effect. Everyone's ordering online. No one needs to go into brick and mortar. And I like to see tenants fail. I'll be honest with you. I want to see tenants fail because it gives way for better opportunities. It's competition, survival of the fittest. And you have these forest fires that kill all the dead brush so that new trees can grow. And it's the same thought process, I think, in this space that we operate in, which is, focus on the tenants you believe in. Are you yourself going to Walgreens and getting your prescription drugs, or are you ordering it online? Where are you going? Where are you, what activities are you engaged in that you can see there's longevity? And there are tenants that I think, there's no substitute for physically going into a brick and mortar location. And that's why Amazon created the Amazon Go concept, because they realized we need brick and mortar. We can't just be online focused. And there's so many others, Warby Parker, Tucked In, so many different tenants that started online recognized the need for brick and mortar. And so our job is, hey, let's understand the client's needs. More importantly, too, let's understand the nuances between what a fast food tenant might have versus a drugstore versus an auto repair. What are the things we're looking for? Because there's 10,000 plus of these properties at any given point, at any given moment. There's just a long list of options. There's probably 5% that are worth pursuing. And so we're digging through all these options to look at the top 10 or 15. And to Kourosh's earlier point, most of the deals we're doing are sourced off market. So it's a real opportunity for our clients to get first pick of options before they hit the market.
Yeah. And I think when you're looking at pricing and returns, you're looking at that risk profile, right? Because it's like, again, when something looks like an attractive cap rate, it's because you got 3 years left on a lease, not 20 years.
And
as
a 5-unit
non-credit tenant
franchisee
versus a credit tenant.
Absolutely.
So a lot of times it's sort of, the cap rates that you see are mirages. So again, this is, it's not perfect, right? Or there's not that perfect equilibrium, and the market doesn't have perfect knowledge, but, that length of lease, who the guarantor is, the industry that they're in, that's going to dictate the return. So you want a higher return, you're going to have to take more risk. It's not more management like it is in the apartment business, where, you go from an A property to a C property, you're going to work a heck of a lot harder in a C property than an A property, but you're going to get that return. It's sort of the same thing here, other than, it's not, you're going to work harder. It's like, hey, you're not
going to sleep at night.
Yeah, you're not going to sleep at night, which again, a lot of folks, they're getting out of it. They want to sleep at night, especially
absolutely.
They own. One last question from me, and then I swear I'm going to shut up for just a
minute. This is fantastic, Gary. We love it.
In terms of, how many of your folks never physically go to look at the, CVS in Sheboygan?
That was my first question to these two gentlemen, but I'll let them answer. No, when I first connected with Kourosh, 6 months
Too
ago, 8
many
months
don't.
ago.
Too many do not. I would say probably 90% don't take the time to fly out and visit the property and view the area and touch and feel what they're actually spending millions of dollars purchasing.
That's
In this day
wild to
and
me.
age, it's wild to me too. But in this day and age, you go on Google Maps and you can do the street view and you can walk that little yellow man down the street. And so that beats having to take a flight out in some cases. I always recommend the client, once you have the property under contract, you have control over the real estate, spend a couple $1,000s, take a flight out, see the space, see the neighborhood, get comfortable with what you're purchasing. But between the phase one, if we do a condition report, a survey, Google Map, that's all they really need.
Yeah.
So,
Well, because that's their question. It's all about the lease. Just review
Yeah.
the lease. My attorney reviewed the lease. Your lawyer reviewed my lease. If
right.
that's good. The deal's good, right? And it's like, well, nah, you're buying because there is a lease. What happens if that lease expires, or like you said, that business model, goes away?
Exactly.
I'm looking at my iPhone, the 8th one in a row I've had, or whatever it is. But then you look at the BlackBerry and it's like, how did BlackBerry, who had 90% of the market, just disappear?
Right.
So you've got those shifts happening.
Yeah.
I wanted to touch on that, and that's kind of the educational component of, I'm a mom and pop apartment owner. I've been doing this for 30 years. You sell me on the net lease deal. My first question is, what happens when this lease ends?
Right.
I'm new to this world. So can you explain a little bit of that process once you get over that hump of selling the folks on the exchange? They're in the property. They're now a triple net landlord who may be extremely inexperienced. Is your team there to kind of help them through some of those growing pains?
Absolutely. We're there it's a lifetime commitment. So long as they own that property in this asset class, we're there to answer any question they may have, whether it's what's your advice on this upcoming lease negotiation, or hey, can you send me the information on the local tax assessor, the local county, so I can make sure the taxes are being sent to the right address. But to answer your question, what happens at the end of the lease term? Typically, these leases have renewal option periods. The most common is 5 years in length. So you'll see, for example, 4 or 5 year options. And so as the lease comes to an end, let's say it's a 10-year lease and now you're in year 9 and 7-ish months, or 9 and just over 6 months, there is a mandatory per the lease, period in which the tenant must give notice if they intend to exercise a renewal option. And so what we most commonly see is 6 months. And so if you're approaching that time period, you should be seeing some sort of correspondence from the tenant. Hey, we intend to exercise a renewal option, or they could even negotiate with you, So the options are: 1, they just exercise a renewal option and stay there. 2, they send you a notice and say, hey, we want to potentially exercise an option for a longer period of time, stay longer than the 5 years. What sort of rent credit will you give us, or sort of negotiation will you play, so that we stay for renew for a 10-year lease, instead of 5 years? Or 3, they may plan to vacate the space, And it's certainly a question that comes up often. I am buying a single tenant net lease deal. The risk is already implied in the name, It's one tenant. So what happens when that one tenant leaves? And advice that we were given in our career is, look, all tenants are temporary. Doesn't matter the asset class. Could be single tenant retail, could be multifamily, etc. So when you go towards buying these investments, have that mind frame, that train of thought that I need to imagine that in the future, whether it's in my ownership period or a future owner for this investment, this tenant will no longer be there, And therefore, it's good to know what you have in the lease, but it's also important to know what you have in the real estate. And so what are the metrics we look at to say this is a good location versus a bad location, especially if an investor lives in Ohio and they're looking at a deal in Texas, or live in California, maybe they're not familiar with Indiana and what good real estate is there. So looking at the demographics, population, the growth, for that population, as well as incomes, traffic drivers, and they've got great technology now where they're measuring cell phone traffic so that you can see where does this, for example, Walgreens rank compared to the state in terms of foot traffic and number of visits. And when they do visit, how long they stay in that store and presumably shop there. Also store sales, right, for a given site.
Sure.
So all these factors come into play so that we can tell the investor with confidence that, hey, this location is a well performer and will probably continue to be even beyond when that tenant leaves, so that they at least know, right, what they have in hand with respect to the location. Another metric that is really important is what is the current rent that the tenant's paying, and how does that compare to the market rent for that area?
Sure.
Because that will be a huge factor in lease negotiations. You can imagine a lot of these buildings are built to suit. Developer builds it with the agreement that the lease will be signed by the tenant. So it's built per the tenant specifications. And so that rent can get inflated quite a bit because, again, they built the building for them, so to pay them back, right, for the tenant to pay them back, them being the developer, they agree to a higher rent during the lease term. And so looking to see how does that rent compare to market and how will that change in the 10, 20 years of that lease, all important factors so that you plan for that future lease negotiation.
Which everything that you just said points out why clients are sellers and people looking at a 1031 need great representation and truly need buyer representation that you guys mentioned that you deal almost exclusively, which maybe you want to just explain the difference between, you know, what that means versus the typical person, you know, the landlord or seller rep selling that, you know, where the benefits of buyer representation in 1031 come in, other than all the great things you just talked about, because you're giving me that information. I'm assuming, you know, we're looking at a Walgreens, you're giving me that, you're showing me that cell phone data and what that looks like.
Sure. Go for it. So the question was, what is the value proposition that Net Lease Exchange offers by representation versus the most common, right, broker?
Yeah. Why am I not looking in, going on LoopNet and just looking for CVS's or, you know, Tubes or whatever? What's the value to engaging folks like you to have a structured search rather than me just going off and seeing what's being advertised right now?
So great question. Because most of our clients are first-time buyers of this asset class, they're selling multifamily, buying net lease. There's that education, right, curve that you need to learn, right? What are the important specifications I need to know how to analyze a certain net lease deal? And so you have options as an owner or investor. You can do it yourself, which if you're a first-time buyer, we do not recommend, right? If you're a first-time buyer of a new product type, whether it's us or another broker, please consult with a real estate broker who's a professional who sees it on a daily basis so they can give you that advice and teach you how to navigate the market. And so as an investor, if at least you come to the conclusion, yeah, I'm going to work with a broker, then it's a matter of what type of broker do I work with? You can, for example, work with your own broker. Maybe it's a multifamily broker who has experience, right, in net lease deals. And I'm sure they're qualified to look at deals and how to analyze net lease. It's just market prevalence and how often they see that activity and touch on that advice so that they can give the right advice to the investor, right? And for us, we believe in the mantra of working with specialists, someone who is very ingrained in that market and that product type. For example, Mehdi and I would never dabble in multifamily, right? Especially in an outside market. It would be doing a client disservice and it wouldn't be an effective use of our time, right? We would much rather refer them out to you guys. Hey, talk to Peter, talk to Gary. All they do is multifamily in Ohio. They're going to give you the best advice, whatever it is. And so it's a similar concept here is if a client knows they want to buy a net lease deal or considering it, they should talk to a net lease broker. And then final distinction is a net lease broker that just does the buy side like our group, or one that does most commonly sell and buy, right? A listing agent who also represents buyers. And that's the most common profile for investment sales broker is, right, they go out, they list property, and as a result of that business, they also represent buyers because they, right, are in tune with the market, which we think, hey, it's better than working with, right, no broker, and it beats a broker in an outside asset class. But we think the advantage of working with a buyer-only broker, if you're as a buyer, is a few, right? One is, look, a listing agent, they're typically most incentivized to sell what's in their inventory. And so when you go and speak with a listing broker, they'll show you what they'll have in their pipeline. But if there's nothing that's a real fit, they're not really as incentivized to go and find other product from other shops. And that's because their time is best spent looking for sellers. And what are net lease sellers? There are some private capital, right, mom and pop sellers that resell net lease, but typically they're developers, right, institutions, or the tenants themselves that these sellers go after. Those are the people they're calling on a daily basis. And so not as much these private capital investors who really need the hand-holding that we think our platform has to offer, going back to expertise and really having a process that's focused. We think we've developed that with NLX and just helping the buy side, especially with 1031 exchanges.
Yeah, great answer. And I think, again, great reasons why your group sort of stands above some of the other choices that our clients would have. And speaking of choices, so, you know, the latest fad in this whole, what do I do next with my proceeds? The word DST has come up. You know, a lot of folks confuse Delaware Statutory Trust and Deferred Sales Trust, and people use the term interchangeably, which they're not the same thing. But maybe if you guys want to explain what that is, how it's sort of similar to a 1031, but it's different.
I can't speak to the deferred sales. That sounds like it's an installment sale. And so you inevitably pay taxes on the proceeds you receive for any given year. It's just spread out over a larger period of time. What I specialize in is the Delaware Statutory Trust, the DST. And it's a competing, I say competing, I also add complementary product to the net lease business. That's our core business, is net lease. You know, I think that the best distinction to make first and foremost is why people buy net lease over the DST is control. Most of our clients, your clients, have controlled their real estate investments. They make all the decisions. They're the decision maker.
Yeah, we work with a few control freaks, just a few.
There you go. And so it's really important to maintain control. And you get that with the net lease property. You're the sole owner, landlord. With the DST, you're a fractional owner. There could be 1,000 other owners in the DST. So as an investor who's coming from an investment where I was the decision maker, it's a tough sell to get clients comfortable with the thought that I'm relinquishing all control and I'm trusting some third party to make the right decisions. So that's a key distinction with the net lease versus the DST. But they are complementary in that they both offer a passive income stream that is 1031 exchange approved. You can trade into a net lease property. You can trade into a Delaware Statutory Trust. The DST is a modification of the TIC model, which was rather cumbersome and onerous for the limited partners that are investing their money. You know, one big issue is everyone had to be on the loan. So if one person stopped making payment, you know, they could foreclose on the other owners.
Right.
Among other issues that with the DST, and it was Revenue Ruling 2004, that approved the DST as exchange allowed, like kind. And so I really like DSTs in the current market because, as I mentioned earlier with the Jiffy Lube example, it's great if you're all cash and you're buying these triple nets without financing. But once you start having a loan component to your 1031 exchange, boy, you start seeing the hit to cash flow when you're taking a 6.25% loan on a 5.5% deal. And so how do we resolve that? How do we resolve this issue where you're negative leverage on a triple net deal when a year ago, even though cap rates were lower, interest rates were that much lower? You were still positive leverage. And so that's where the DST has been, I think, pivotal and complementary to our net lease practice, where we have clients who they have a small loan component. They don't want to go replace that debt with a new loan on a triple net. So they'll go the DST route. These DSTs are already packaged, ready to go. The loan is in place and it's non-recourse to the investor. So me, who's, let's say, 65 years old and I'm retired, I don't have income besides my investment property, I don't have to worry about, do I qualify for the loan dollars I'm applying for on a standard loan with a triple net property? I put my money into the DST, I get my pro rata share of the loan dollars. LTVs are as low as 0. And we have 2 zero cash flow DSTs that offer 78% loan to value. We're actually helping a client in Portland,
Right.
who's selling a hotel, 75% loan to value. No way they're going to be able to replace 75% in the current market. So they're going to put the money into a 0 cash flow DST and avoid having to pay taxes on debt relief, which that's the worst, having to shell out cash on money you don't even have.
Right. Yeah. No, that the phantom income kind of thing. So there really is 0 cash flow DSTs. I remember Roger Staubach made the 0 cash flow business model in single tenant sort of business, and went away for a little bit. But yeah. Wow. Now we've heard a bunch of different things. So, DSTs are possible to sort of rescue a failed exchange.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, because it's already packaged and ready to go. One of the biggest pain points for us, candidly, with the triple nets is the lead time. It's a typical real estate transaction where you're, offer, acceptance, PSA negotiation. By the time you have it under contract, that's 2 weeks at least. Then you start doing your due diligence. You have to order a phase 1 environmental. Well, with the phase 1 environmental, that can take 3 weeks to come in, 2 to 3 weeks. So by the time you actually know this property is clean, it checks out, everything is good to go, you're in the deal for about a month, plus or minus. And you think for someone who just sold their property and is in their 45-day window, that month goes by quick. And you find out an issue has come up on day 30 and you only have 15 days left to identify. Absolutely. The DST is a huge, huge tool for folks that are worried about a failed exchange. They'll go ahead and nominate their first or second preferred options, but they'll have in the third slot a DST nominated. And that's because it takes less than 5 days to purchase your interest in a DST. It's strictly paperwork, connecting the accommodator to the sponsor, signing some papers, wiring funds. Now you're the owner of a 300-unit Class A multifamily in Texas, or at least a partial owner.
And we've had clients successfully do that. Like 2 years ago now, we had a client successfully trade out of, an 80-year-old sort of apartment building in a very workforce housing suburb without a bright future, but a future into sort of 3 or 4 Class A deals that were in, very high demand, high growth markets. Right. And they're like, hey, this is, again, we're going to make the same amount of money, which is kind of amazing. But the bigger thing is, our heirs or their heirs are now diversified in much better real estate. You don't have to worry about who the hell is going to manage this thing. And, a workforce housing deal, and this a little bit, you have a Class C deal, you've got to be a hands-on operator, because if not, you're going to get crushed.
I know it because I own it in Daly City and I'm having to go there today after having been there last week. It's never ending. Absolutely. Yeah.
So yeah.
I do.
There's a thing, in fact, we have clients and it's a little bit of an advanced technique. What is it? I'll let you guys explain it. A straddled exchange. So the second I have a client say, well, let's do a straddled exchange. It's like, okay, this guy's got a little bit of experience and and what they're doing and what they're trying to do.
That's a term I haven't heard.
Basically what it is sort of, if your 45-day, your 45-day window kicks you into the next tax year.
Yep. And so you actually have less than 180 days.
Correct. Or you basically, you make your identification. Let's say you close November 1st, and then, you make your 45 days election. Then you don't close on any of the properties. When does the exchange fail? It fails when you didn't close on the properties, right? So that's when you recognize the gain. So you took basically the exchange from this year and put that gain into next year.
Right.
So again, it's back to one of the things people are always concerned about, which is like, what if I screw up my exchange? I can't find the property I want. I can't do this. How do I manage that process? And so obviously tax deferral is, even though it's 1 year, may make a difference to some people, based on some of the things that they can do and use. So, well, fantastic. Peter,
Guys,
any sort of questions to wrap up here?
No, I think we're, maybe if we could jump into we discussed some case studies. So I think we covered a good amount of that. Guys, where can our listeners find you?
Let's see. We're on LinkedIn. Our individual bios are there. We've got our website, colliers.com/NLX. Those have been the two most productive channels for us. Until we run our own podcast, have you guys guest star one day? Maybe give us some pointers on that.
And you guys feel free to contact any of our team members to sort of put you in contact as well.
When did you launch the podcast?
Podcast launched, we're about 18 months into it.
Wow, good for you guys.
Yeah, we're about 18 months into it. And again, it's a focused podcast for apartment owners, investors, and everyone in between. So again, I know there's going to be a lot of nuggets from this pod. Appreciate you guys joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us. This has been a great experience. And I'm curious if the podcast has been beneficial for your business. Obviously, it's educational for the listeners, but does that translate to more opportunities for the team?
God, I'm not used to getting questions on the pod.
It definitely has.
I imagine
it has, because again, I think we cover subjects a little bit more in depth that again our clients are talking about, right? So we've covered cost segregation. We've obviously now with 1031, we've hired real estate property tax appeals and different property tax acts. So we try to cover really ground level stuff that's important to the multifamily client, and sort of talk about it in a way that they can relate back to.
100%. Yeah, I mean, the best thing is when you're talking to a client, and maybe a first time call with a prospective client, and it's, wait a minute, are you guys are you the Rust Belt Apartment Podcast?
That's so cool.
So to answer your question, yes, it's been very beneficial, and it allows us to make connections like this.
Sure.
So I'm really glad you guys joined us. You kind of threw me off with the question. Boy.
You took it like a champ. So you have a bright future in joining podcasts and fielding questions.
Thank you.
Well, gentlemen, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. Guys, if you want to get in touch with either Kourosh or Mehdi, they're very active on LinkedIn. We'll also include their contact information, any marketing material that goes out. As always, thanks for listening.